Mr. Putter and Tabby ring the bell. Crispy fall. It was fall. Mr. Putter and his fine cat Tabby loved fall. Mr. Putter liked the apples. Tabby liked the leaves. They both liked the crispy wind. And sometimes their neighbor, Mrs. Teaberry, brought them rhubarb trifle. They really liked that. Fall was fun. The school bell. One day, while Mr. Putter was raking leaves and Tabby was attacking leaves, they hear the school bell ring. Dong, dong, dong. Mr. Putter stopped raking. He looked at Tabby. "I miss school," said Mr. Putter. "I miss pencils and books." Tabby stopped attacking. She purred. "I miss gloves and erasers," said Mr. Putter. Dong, dong, dong went the bell. "I would like to go back to school," said Mr. Putter, "just for one day." Just then, Mrs. Teaberry's good dog, Jig, ran by. Jig was wearing half a cake on his head. The other half was inside Jig. Mr. Putter looked at Jig. Mr. Putter looked at Tabby. "I have an idea," said Mr. Putter. Tabby purred and purred. She loved Mr. Putter's ideas. Mrs. Teaberry. Mr. Putter knocked on Mrs. Teaberry's door. Jig stood beside Tabby. All of the cake was now inside Jig. Mrs. Teaberry opened the door. There you are," she said. "Yes, here I am," said Mr. Putter. "No, I meant Jig," said Mrs. Teaberry. "He stole the banana cake." "That was banana cake?" asked Miss Putter. Mr. Putter looked sad. "I love banana cake," he said. "So does Jig," said Mrs. Teaberry. Everyone looked at Jig. Jig looked happy. Jig looked fun. Jig looked showy. "Mrs. Teaberry," said Mr. Putter, "I have an idea." "Oh, good," said Mrs. Teaberry. "I love ideas. Do you love gloves and erasers?" asked Miss Putter. "Pardon me?" said Mrs. Teaberry. Mr. Putter began telling her his idea. Tabby purred and purred. Pet tricks. The first grade teacher at the school thought it was a lovely idea. "Show and tell," she said to Mrs. Teaberry on the phone. "What a good idea! The children love cats and dogs. Do yours do tricks?" Mrs. Teaberry looked at Jig. He was wearing his water ball. "Sort of," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Wonderful," said the teacher. "Come right over." Mrs. Teaberry called Mr. Putter. "It worked," she said. "We are going to school." "Hooray!" said Mr. Putter. "But the teacher wants pet tricks," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Pet tricks?" asked Mr. Putter. He looked at Tabby, who was napping in the soup pot. Oh, said Mr. Putter. Tabby knew how to nap. Tabby knew how to purl. But could Tabby do tricks? Show and tell. Mr. Putter and Tabby and Mrs. T-Berry and Jig walked to the school. They stepped through the door. It smelled just like school, said Mr. Putter. They found the first grade room. Mrs. T-Berry straightened Jig's tie. Mr. Putter patted Tabby's head. Then they went in. Mr. Putter was in heaven. It was a room filled with books and pencils and gloves and erasers and, best of all, children. The teacher told the children that Tabby and Jig could do tricks. Everyone waited. Tabby purled. Jig scratched at his tie. No one did a trick. Uh-oh, said Mr. Putter. Oh dear, said Mrs. T-Berry. Suddenly the school bell began to ring. Dong! It was very loud. Tabby jumped straight up in the air. She landed on a little girl's lap in the front row. The little girl screamed. Dong! Jig jumped straight up in the air. He landed in a box of cupcakes. Don't eat all the cupcakes, the teacher yelled. Dong! Jig ate all the cupcakes. Then Jig did a trick. It was a good trick. Tabby did it too. It was a disappearing trick. And that was the end of show and tell. The worst ever. Back home, Mr. Putter made tea for Mrs. T-Berry while Tabby and Jig napped. They looked at Jig. His tie was full of cupcake. They looked at Tabby. Her tail was quite festive. Mr. Putter smiled. Mrs. T-Berry smiled. Then they started laughing. It had been the worst show and tell ever. But they were happy. Mr. Putter got to go to school, and Tabby and Jig learned a few new tricks. Dear first graders, sorry about show and tell. Please accept our cupcakes and apologize. You're truly Mrs. T-Berry and Mr. Putter.